welcome back to the Washington Outsider Report on Coalition Radio. My name is Irina Zuckerman, and I am the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. With us today is Jeffrey Fischer. He's an author, he's an expert on European and global security, a member of international boards, media analyst, and also a specialist on NATO defense attaché joint staff. He's been in 7 combat tours, and he'll tell you all about that himself directly. He's based in Austria, and the issue we are looking at today is Russia's ambitions for Europe beyond Ukraine. What would that look like? Right now, a lot of the focus is on the combat in Ukraine, which is quite understandable, but is Russia planning an expansion of its operations? What could that look like? Are there asymmetrical operations that Russia is currently already engaged in, a way to paving way for more conventional warfare in a little while, as some of the media is starting to bring out in recent discussions. And we'll be talking about all of that today. Jeffrey, thank you so much for joining us today. Could you tell us a little bit about your background and how you got into this area?
Sure. So first of all, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to always to be able to talk with folks out there. So I have a 30-year military career, retired as a colonel out of the United States Air Force. And yes, you're right. I did have 7 combat tours. Most of it was in aviation and electronic warfare, but I did do a ground tour in Afghanistan. And for a year, after I had made lieutenant colonel and then up to colonel, I moved into the diplomatic realm. So I served in U.S. embassies that were in Vienna and in Kosovo, and then rounded out my tour retiring as a senior officer at a NATO Special Ops headquarters. So after retiring and moving back to Austria with my wife, who is Austrian, I started taking a lot of interest in how Europe was perceiving the war that was going on in Ukraine. I started writing articles about it. I met a lot of folks, and then started being asked to be a TV analyst and a spokesperson, and that's how I ended up on your show.
Well, thank you so much for this. It's I think it's going to be an interesting conversation. And despite the topic being mostly focused on NATO and the rest of Europe, I actually do want to start with Ukraine because it's immediately relevant. And the biggest question is, of course, what is happening out there? There's a lot of very uneven coverage claiming that due to the slowdown in U.S. aid, Ukraine has paused its counteroffensive. The new plan by the US allegedly is focused exclusively on defensive operations and certainly not on reclaiming any more of the territories that Russia is allegedly advancing in certain areas. Is that accurate?
It is, but there's glimmers of hope, right? So I won't disagree with anything that you just said, but recently we just saw that the European Union has authorized $50 billion. Hungary is no longer blocking, so Viktor Orban, the president of Hungary, has withdrew his negative or his veto vote on that. So we'll see 50 billion go. And it's interesting. The United States, I agree with you that the themes and narratives that we hear coming out of the White House right now seem to be more in this defensive posture and no longer so offensively focused. But then we also heard just recently that they sent over a bunch of small diameter bombs, or SDB-1s, which have a glide rate. It's a ground launch, a ground based small diameter bomb, right? So it's launched from the ground, and it can glide out to about 150 kilometers. So we've seen Ukraine using these with some success into Crimea over the past few days. So it's interesting, right? I think that there's a lot of there's a little bit of mixed messaging out there, so it's kind of hard to see that, pull the wheat from the chaff here.
And another issue that's been a lot in the news is that the alleged upcoming replacement of Zelensky with another figure. How accurate is that, and how will it reflect on Ukraine's strategy, if at all? Should the rest of the world be concerned about this, or is it an entirely internal matter that's not going to lead to any major changes?
Yeah, that's a great question. I will tell you that Zelensky and Ukraine are doing themselves no favors right now with the messaging that's coming out of Kiev on this, right?
Hmm.
If you're Zelensky and you want to keep him, you need to go out in public and you need to say that I'm going to keep him. And if you're Zelensky and you don't want to keep him, you need, that you need to fish or cut bait, as the old phrase goes, right?
Hmm.
This narrative continuing for the past few days, as you've alluded to, is not helping the war. It's not helping the Ukraine. It's not helping the morale of the soldiers. That it's getting a lot of negative press and it's overshadowing some of the positive things that Ukraine's actually doing in the battle space.
There's been a lot in general coming out about the alleged political tensions at the top in Ukraine. To what extent, and that's normal part of governance in any country, but at the time of war, to what extent has Russia been able to capitalize on that for A, political and B, military gains?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Russia is really good at capitalizing on in the information space. They're really good at it. I'm not a fan of Vladimir Putin, but I will tell you that they've gotten a PhD in the information domain in the information space. What I would say is, I think the world needs to take a deep breath. I'm a Russian history major by trade, right? So that's what I studied back in college, and a little bit of U.S. history. And we had a civil war in the United States, right? And in the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln went through a handful of general officers in charge of the Union forces, and it wasn't until we finally got Grant at the end that we won. So the notion that a sitting, politically elected official would choose to sack or terminate the chief of defense is not, it's not the end of the world. It does happen. There are expectations in warfare that political leaders have, and if the current chief of defense was not living up to those for Zelensky, then maybe he needs to go find somebody else.
Uh, so while all of that is going on simultaneously, there's been a lot of positive publicity about Ukraine's innovative attitude towards using what they have in the most creative and flexible way possible. And actually, from what I understand, Ukraine's been as a theater of war has been, a field for experimentation in the technological innovation since 2014, since the Crimea invasion. Uh, some of the issues that we've read about before this current phase of the war in 2022 was had a lot to do with the electronic space, with the jamming, with those operations. We are hearing somewhat less about it now, even though my understanding is that's still ongoing. Could you tell us a little bit how these types of operations fit into the general sphere of the war? We're hearing a lot about, direct kinetic action, less about these sort of things. We hear about cybersecurity strikes, but not about electronic aspects.
Yeah. So the first two combat airplanes that I flew were an airplane called the EC-130H Compass Call, and then the EA-6B Prowler, which are both counter communications and counter electronic warfare, and operate in the electromagnetic spectrum. Right. This was the domain that I fought in, right, if you will. And I will tell you, this battle space, as you rightly allude to, is amazing, right? You're seeing jamming upon jamming, and direction finding and homing on jammers, right? So now it's not only enough to have a jammer, but if you know your enemy has one, you're going to build a missile with a receiver that's going to home in on that jamming and destroy the jammer, right? So and it's having an effect in the battle space, right? If you look at it to an aerial shot of the battle space, you don't see precision warfare in this, right? You see tons of scarred earth, right? Artillery that's just landed all over the airspace, and it's not precision, right? It's not landing exactly where it needs to land,
Mhm.
and that's in a large part because GPS is being denied to both sides, right? So if you can't guide your weapons on GPS, they basically become dumb ordnance, and they land where they land. On top of that, you have communications jamming, you have radar jamming. When one side tries to turn on a very advanced radar, and get some cueing, whether that be counter battery artillery radars or whether that be ground control intercept radars for aircraft, immediately the enemy's going to see it because they have signals intelligence that will collect on that, and once they see it, they're going to try and shoot it and terminate it. So the battle space, the electronic spectrum has become wildly used in this. You see drones and commercial off the shelf assets that are coming in that are phenomenal, right? And And then you talked a little bit about innovation, right? And I think it was just this past Thursday that we saw a incident where the Ukrainians sunk another one of the Russian ships. And I will tell you that as a guy who studies war and studied it for 30 years, this is very interesting, right? And I'll lay it out for you. In Crimea, earlier in the day, you had reports where Ukraine was targeting Russian occupation forces in and around the entire Crimea Peninsula. Well, if you're the Black Sea Fleet commander, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to try and get your ships out of the harbor, right? Because they're sitting ducks while they're sitting in the harbor. If Crimea is being targeted, you're going to order your ships out to sea. And then that very night, there's been video released by the Ukrainians where they, 4 or 5 of these, kayak, Starlink controlled drones with bombs basically just went up and sunk a Russian ship. And I bring those two things together because this shows a higher level of strategic planning, right? In other words, they knew what Russia's reaction would be from targeting the peninsula, and they laid a trap with these 5 drones out in the middle of the sea, waiting for the ship to exit the port and then sink it. So very fascinating. And these drones cost maybe what $10,000-$20,000 a piece. These little kayak ships with a motor and a bomb. So it's brilliant planning. This was multi-million-dollar vessel for the Russian Navy, and it's gone.
In the meantime, there's been a lot of also confusion surrounding aerial capabilities from the beginning. A no-fly zone was off the table from NATO standpoint. They were not going to engage in that way. But at the same time, there was a lot of complaints that Ukrainians did not receive adequate aerial equipment in time, or in time to disentrench the Russians before they really dug into their positions and which made it very difficult to basically dislodge them from there. It's starting to change. The F-16 training is starting to go in. Ukraine's been getting more advanced drones with producing them with Turkey and so forth. But still, it appears that it has really delayed any sort of major progress in countering Russian advance. And now Russia seem to be getting around a lot of the sanctions, a lot of the limitations on their own production. They're getting weapons from Iran, from North Korea, getting parts from China. What is the landscape now? Is there any way? I mean, U.S. supplied Ukraine with a lot of advanced weapons lately, but so far this whole thing with the airplanes and what they actually really need to see for fast advances, it still seems to be not getting through. What's the problem here? What's the obstacle towards getting Ukraine aerial superiority?
Yeah, so if you're good on Joe Biden for helping Ukraine and bad on Joe Biden for not helping enough, right? I think it's kind of the where I think a lot of people who support U.S. support or who are in favor of U.S. support to Ukraine. Yeah, a year ago this month, I was writing op-ed articles for the Kiev Post as a huge advocate for F-16s and why they should be going in, why the United States was wrong. I agree with you. I think that F-16s would have made a significant difference in that summer offensive. I think a lot of people expected them to be there for the summer offensive that faltered in the land domain, right? I think the summer offensive actually did pretty good in the naval domain and the information domain, and we can have that talk. But I agree, F-16 should have been there. It's fascinating. I don't think that there's anyone who's an expert in warfare, especially air warfare, would say that we would ever see in the future a 3-year war campaign, conventional war campaign, where neither side had secured air superiority, right? That's just unfathomable, right? Because we look at how important air warfare is, and if we have recent examples in 1999, in just 78 days, the United States and coalition forces brought Slobodan Milosevic to the bargaining table where he surrendered, right, and in Serbia without a boot on the ground. And then we look at with Saddam Hussein in the early 90s. Again, conventional air power is phenomenal, and why it wasn't given to Ukraine in this battle, I don't know. I realize there's a lot of people who say that Russia has some pretty advanced ground-based air defense systems, and perhaps the S-300 and the S-400 at the beginning of this war were perceived as being extremely lethal. I think U.S. and Western intelligence will easily come back and say that they overestimated the capabilities of these. They're not as capable, and there's people out there who are big Russia advocates who will say that that's an inaccurate assessment. I would just ask those people that say such things that, go back to just a couple of months ago where the Dubai Air Show, which is the second largest air show in the world, right?
Mhm.
Russia's military and Russia's defense industry rolled out tons and tons of systems that they wanted the world to buy, right? Their ground-based air defense systems, airplanes, everything in the aviation world, and they ended up with zero sales, right? So when Russia has zero sales in the defense world, in the aviation defense world at the Dubai Air Show, it's a really, it's a bad day for the Russian defense industry. Nobody trusts their stuff.
Uh, so here's the question though. Okay,
Okay.
Russia is maybe not doing as great as expected. Nevertheless, they're still a much larger country. They still have
Mhm.
significant resources to expand on this, and they're still able to procure whatever they need to procure to keep themselves going. They didn't just, the entire fleet has not been completely annihilated by this point. They're able
Mhm.
to replace both the people and the equipment. Uh,
Sure.
and it's very obvious that without giving a very clear edge at this point by whoever, whether it's US, Europe, some other countries that are willing to, beginning to perceive Russia as a threat, there's not going to be, a clear ending to all of this for the foreseeable future. Instead, it's going to be a lot of money thrown into continuing, stalemate, so to speak, with Russia obviously having the advantage of having all the resources to spend and not having any of its lands occupied and having a significantly greater population and so on and so forth. So at what point that does NATO decide, okay, this has gone far enough, we've expended enough resources that at this point we need to put an end to this rapidly. This is obviously Putin is not going to nuke anybody. Obviously, he's not going to do anything, that he hasn't already done. So we need to kind of really, if we want to finish it, this is the point. Where does that discussion come in? Because from my understanding, the $50 billion and so forth, they're going to be dispersed over time and in parcel. This is not going to be some huge package of, atoms and whatever else that just comes in all at once. And I
Right.
haven't heard anything again about any aerial reinforcements regarding that. I may be wrong, it may come up, but so far I haven't heard, you know. So what's the stumbling block? It can't just be Biden because we are talking about Europe now. They're not beholden. Biden can do whatever he wants to do, but you have all these other countries. You have Canada, you have all these European states.
Yeah. So look, I'm critical of Russia a lot, but I think it's important to realize that this war is still going on, and there's still a worthy adversary, right? As much as I think that the West doesn't like to hear that, that Russia. When I'm critical of Russia, I think we have to put that in context. At the beginning of this war, they were considered the second most powerful military in the world, right? And they were unable to, the 3 days to Kyiv is now turned into 3 years, and we've got a little bit of land in the east in Crimea. So I'm critical because there were greater expectations placed on Russia and far less expectations placed on Ukraine, and that's changed, right? So that's why I'm critical of Russia. But you're right, there's still a worthy adversary. I think if you wanted to look at and you wanted to try and make assess how this battle space is. I've often said to people like this is a heavyweight prize fight that's in the late rounds, right? Both are really tired. Both are trying to throw haymakers and knock the other one out, but they're beaten. They're really tired. It's late rounds. Political and populist support for this war is starting to wane in both nations, right? In Russia and in Ukraine. Being able to recruit and bring forces to the front are a challenge for both countries. Russia does have more resources to draw upon. You're completely right. But when we talk about in the context of NATO, right? What's NATO going to be able to do? Well, NATO by definition is a defensive force, and there's no article that allows NATO to take on an offensive force, right? So NATO can actually provide weapons, and they can continue doing these things as individual countries, or as the the NSPA, the NATO Special Support and Procurement Agency, which is is being led. The general manager is a very good friend of mine, Stacey Cummings. We talk a lot. They recently just spun up more artillery production. These are good things to help Ukraine, but here's I think the crux and probably the most important thing we really need to get at in our discussion, right? Russia's defense industry is spooling up, right? So they're being able to make more artillery, they're being able to make more weapons, they're being able to make more systems, and as that spools up, right, it just doesn't shut off, right? It didn't turn on like a light. It doesn't turn off like a light. It takes time to spin it up, and it takes time to spin it down, right? So should the war in Ukraine end, Russia and Vladimir Putin are going to be sitting on stockpiles of munitions, right? Because it won't turn off immediately. So when we talk about potentially Vladimir Putin's aspirations in Poland or Lithuania or Latvia, Estonia, the Baltics, I think that these are things that NATO should be concerned about, right? And you look at General Cavoli, who's the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe right now, right? They're putting on the largest NATO exercise since the 80s or 90s, right? 60,000 forces are running around Europe right now in a massive exercise that there's no secret, right? The exercise is completely predicated on a Russia offensive into a NATO country. There's no secret about it. It's not even a fake, that like fake names for the countries and Istam Chakatuka or some crazy country. This is if Russia invades us, and this is what we're going to do. And they're holding it out in the open to show Russia and show Vladimir Putin what the response would be.
So this leads me to the question that you made a very important point, by the way, about defensive mandate versus offensive capabilities, and I'll get to that. Right now, I want to take this kind of revert back to something we were discussing earlier, which is the fact that while Ukraine has been this theater of experimentation for electromagnetic capabilities, for cyber capabilities, at the same time, this entire time, Russia has actually been attacking some of the NATO countries, albeit in non-kinetic ways. Estonia, Poland, all these countries have been suffering all sorts of cyber attacks, even electronic attacks. And I'm curious, and obviously Russia has been very careful calibrating and pushing the envelope and testing the capabilities that and just looking at this big picture, where is it all going? Because it's obviously able to do all of that while simultaneously fighting and doing the same things in Ukraine. And obviously, this entire time, the last 10 years, they've been able to do that without it getting out of hand and leading to direct combat. But that could change at any moment, and it can change when Russia decides that it changes. So the question is, at what point does that sort of asymmetrical activity that cannot be fully called defense and that doesn't fully bring up all the NATO Article 5 concerns that everyone has, and that, by the way, are not fully clear just how far they actually go, and is that even an automatic process, and what does it entail? At what point do these asymmetrical operations do enough damage and cross enough of a line, to cross over to trigger a major reaction? And what is exactly Russia trying to accomplish by engaging in this low-grade conflict? Do you see it as a potential for escalation in that sphere?
Yeah, this is the million-dollar question, right? And I think context matters, and I want to pull on that thread a little bit, right? If my math is correct, in 2011, Estonia suffered a massive cyber attack from Russia, right? It nearly shut down their banking industry. People couldn't get cash. There was a significant challenge. At the time, Estonia had the idea that they were going to bring forward this as a NATO 5 NATO 5 violation, that they were attacked. If one's attacked, they're all attacked. In 2011, that would have never materialized. Today, right? If Russia had done the same thing to Estonia today, I think in the context of what's going on in Ukraine, in Georgia, Moldova, Transnistria, Abkhazia, I mean, at this point, it's pretty clear, right, that this slow, ever slow moving encroachment by Russia back into the aspirations of the old Russian Empire. I think at this point, these things might actually tick an Article 5 commitment, right? And then when they vote on Article 5, right, if one's attacked, they're all attacked, then it's a NATO response to defend one nation. And that doesn't mean that every country has to come forward with troops and, and tanks and airplanes, but they do have to provide support in some way. And, for your viewers, they're probably smart enough to know that there's only been one time in all of history where, NATO actually did have an Article 5 violation that was validated by the North Atlantic Council, and that was when the United States was attacked on September 11th.
So in the meantime, we are seeing that, there's a lot of discussion about what would happen if Russia were indeed to actually attack one of the NATO countries. And we've seen that NATO has been doing everything possible to avoid escalation. We've had a previous incident when there were jet planes from Belarus that encroached into Polish airspace, and it did not lead to a massive mobilization, obviously. There's also a discussion just how prepared are NATO countries outside the United States for any major confrontation, and whether Russia is capable of maintaining a multi-front warfare effort. By the way, I don't see why not. If they have X number of people to sacrifice in Ukraine and maintain this continuous stalemate without increasing capabilities on Ukraine side, I don't see why they couldn't have also additional forces to send elsewhere if push comes to shove, theoretically speaking. So let's talk about NATO's Article 5 and what exactly it would entail under what circumstances. Because the way people interpreted it, oh, well, if Russia throws a bomb there, then everybody has to go and fight Russia, and Russia nukes Ukraine, then what do we do then? But in reality, I'm not entirely sure this process is as simple, as people say, because A, there's incentive to avoid escalation, and B, we don't know what sort of defense who and how the process of what is considered an appropriate defensive response would be decided. It may not necessarily call for full mobilization. It could call for some limited action and so forth. So what are some of the war game scenarios that have been played out so far? What's the most realistic path, depending on what Russia chooses to do in the near future?
Yeah, I think if you look at Crimea and what happened there, this is this is the template that Russia uses, right? The first stage that there's going to be an information campaign that ethnic Russians and minority ethnics Russians in Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, or Poland are being oppressed, and they're being subjugated and enslaved by the leadership. They're being blah blah, and Mother Russia has to go in and protect their people. You'll see a buildup along the borders of military forces. But those military forces, according to Russia, even though we have satellite imagery of them, they're there for an exercise or all these different things. There's always an excuse, right? In 2014, I was actually I was the senior military advisor to the OSCE. I don't know if you're familiar with the Organization for Security and Cooperation. Yeah, so I was the senior military advisor there, right? I was advising the ambassador, and we were, everyone in the room is looking at these pictures of all the Russian forces that are along the border of Luhansk and Donetsk, and you're looking at the Russian ambassador across the room, like how can you deny like these are satellite images, they're not doctored, it's not AI, this is 2014, it's not 2024, and I don't know what you're talking about. We have no forces there, and there were the little green men that came off that this wasn't Russian forces, it was little green men that came off the boats in Crimea and Sevastopol and started taking over Crimea. So this is the template. This is the modus operandi that Russia uses. That's what's going to happen. I think that the good news, if you want good news out of this situation, is I don't think Russia has the immediate capability to go do this their military has been pretty significantly damaged and
Mhm.
decimated in the Ukraine war. So they're going to have to do some regrouping and refitting and stuff like that. But I don't think there's any doubt in anyone's mind at this point that Vladimir Putin does have greater aspirations. All you have to do is listen to him, right? I mean, he's basically saying it, so it's not like it's up in the air anymore.
So in light of that, increasing his rhetoric, we've seen him visit Kaliningrad, and that's one of the you know one of those strategic locations where you can just expect. It's like a political candidate in the U.S. visiting Iowa. It's not because it's not for the scenery or the Broadway shows. Clearly, there's something of strategic value that is there's some expectation being built up, and building up expectations and then not following through on them is not a good look for somebody in Putin's position. So can we expect, I know that Poland has expressed concerns about being the next target, but from this movement it seems to me that Lithuania is a far more likely next candidate for some sort of an attack. And I think this game of chicken, you know, uh, there is an expectation from Russia that because NATO did not fully even commit to Ukraine, and by fully, I mean have not done everything possible to win that war as quickly as possible, they may not be, all that enthused to fully commit to defending even one of their own smaller members either, despite all the recent moves with Finland and Sweden joining the ranks and expanding capabilities and so forth. There's still, in terms of nations, there's still some countries that have not increased their budget sufficiently, and quite frankly, the entire organization is lagging behind, even if they're trying to catch up now.
Yeah, so it's interesting, right? Whether it's the Baltics or Poland, I think it's going. Those are the desires, right? You're right. What's interesting though is NATO's created a pretty complex problem for Vladimir Putin. You've got a new division headquarters going into Poland, right? A U.S. division headquarters is going to Poland. That's probably not the place you want to attack, right? If you got a whole U.S. division that's headquarters, that is probably not good. But then you look at the Baltics, right? Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. Well, for the last, 10-ish years, there's been the NATO air policing role going on. So you've got the US Air Force, the British Air Force, the French Air Force, literally flying fighter jets 24/7 over Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, bedded down in those countries, right? These are on permanent rotation NATO forces that are controlling the airspace. If Russia wants to do something, they're going to have to see some level of de-escalation in that, because I think it would almost be suicide to try and go into those countries while that air policing mission was going on.
Meanwhile, Russia's been doing what it does best, which is infiltrating, dividing politically, and increasing its active measures and intelligence operations in basically everywhere. All of that is relatively low cost compared to combat, and mobilization allows them to gather information about capabilities very effectively. We've seen outright sabotage in Germany over lines of support for Ukraine, and who knows what else has been sabotaged by assorted well-placed agents of influence. So how far can Russia extend this political creep before it actually does not really have to do all that much in terms of combat, really?
Yeah. Yeah, so you're talking my language, because I live in a country where espionage is legal, right? Austria is one of the few countries where espionage is completely legal, as long as you don't collect on an Austrian, right? So, the sabotage that goes on in Germany is frustrating, right? I think as Westerners, we get angry with these things, but I think it's important. I have some friends that work in three-letter agencies and stuff like that, and if you're going to conduct sabotage, the first thing you do is, you protect your own nest before you go, beat up someone else's nest. And that's Russia's biggest problem, right? Russia is such a vast land and has so many military bases and assets that Ukraine has proven very, very quite capable, right, of going in and sabotaging the Russian bases and setting fire to their airplanes and blowing up refineries. Well, I shouldn't say that. Presumed that Ukraine these refineries are just catching fire left and right, and I don't know, maybe they just have really bad fire regulations. But right, so if you're going to conduct sabotage in someone else's nation, you probably better protect your own nest before you go. And I think that's Russia's fatal error in this area.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because on the one hand, Russia has been criticized for, having bad counterintelligence. A lot of their agents simply fail. They get caught. The intelligence operations get quickly and easily unraveled. On the other hand, they are willing to throw so much stuff into it, then maybe it's just a numbers game for them. They expect a certain number of people to get caught, and then some of those people do enough damage before they burn out, that it may be worth it, especially if these people are relatively low cost, if they're already part of the local diaspora, and then don't require significant investments in training and so forth.
Yeah.
And and maybe Russia looks at it from this, okay, we'll get fire here and there, but is that really serious damage? We can put out a fire. The Ukrainians cannot they cannot do anything more than just do symbolic acts that really don't endanger our core capabilities. So whatever, it's worth it. Maybe we can't be everywhere, but we're still doing enough. For us, it's worth taking a bit of this minimal damage, as long as we cause enough uproar on the other side. So looking at this political calculus of their military and paramilitary activity, I'm not entirely sure that they're completely wrong, because their own ranks have remained pretty much, as far as I see, solid. If anything, they've gone more as purges continue of anyone even remotely questioning the course of action. They've become pretty much single-handedly very much in control of their own political situation, whereas we are seeing heated debates increase all over Europe, and we've seen some European countries bring governments up, bring new governments in that have been criticized for being insufficiently anti-Russian, if not more than that. So their political game may be winning them a very long-term advantage, and and meanwhile they're not really suffering all that much. And this brings me to your earlier point about defensive versus offensive capabilities. They're joining ranks with this coalition of aggressive nations: Iran, China, North Korea, and essentially announcing themselves as part of these operations that are even beyond Europe, in Asia Pacific, in the Pacific, in the Middle East. They're playing some sort of a supportive role. They're certainly building up relationships with countries that they used to see is outright rivals and competitors, or what lesser states like North Korea. So I'm not entirely sure that Russia is getting it completely wrong in terms of a larger picture. Yes, they're not great on the details. Yes, they've got some damage over time, but if they're able to join forces with all these states, can't they compensate for these failures in significant enough way? Would it be, for instance, out of the question that in the future they could get some of the Chinese capabilities to guard their bases?
Um, that's a big question, right? I mean, yeah, there's a lot in there. So look, there's a lot of nations out there that want to help, or have some desire to help Russia, but there's a lot of challenges there, right?
Mhm.
If you want any access to U.S. weapons, right, through foreign military sales, if you want F-16s, or if you want parts for your jets, if you want, if you're not happy with what the United States is doing against Iran right now, and you're Egypt, well, you can bite your tongue, but your main fighting force for your air is F-16. So how vocal do you want to be against the United States, right? If you want to have parts for your F-16, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, all these nations fly U.S. assets, and and use Patriot missile systems. The Western systems are the best in the world, and they want that for their country, but they're beholden to the U.S. contracts through foreign military sales and foreign military funding. You know, I could China actually bring their forces in to protect some of these bases? Sure, but I would tell you that, you know, it's interesting. I had a discussion about BRICS, right? The BRICS is
Mhm.
growing. It's all these nations out there, and this is going to be some economic powerhouse. And I kind of chuckle, right? And the reason I chuckle is, look, the North Atlantic Council, even though we're Anglo-Saxon, European, you know, predominantly white, you know, we all believe in, you know, Christianity and Catholicism are the main religion. So we're relatively similar. We don't get along at NATO, at North Atlantic Council, very well at all, right? That there's, you know, 30, 31 nations that have a challenge. The notion that a communist China, a, you know, oligarchish led Russia, and India that's, you know, completely different, are somehow going to be able to aspire to a unified position is it just makes me chuckle, right? I laugh at this. So okay, yeah, and you know, and you know, the European Union's facing the same challenge. Again, the European Union, it's Europe, right? And they want to have a defense force now. They realize that they need better defense, and I don't disagree with them. They don't. They want a defense structure that is void of U.S. influence, and that's why the European Union is being chosen. And the problem they have is they all agree that this is a good idea, and then they all say they want to lead it, right? They're like, well, it's a great idea if I'm in charge. Well, no, France, you know, England doesn't want you to be in charge, and England, Germany doesn't want you to be in charge, and Germany, France doesn't want you, you know, they all want to be in charge, right? So it's a challenge to bring together these alliances. And it's a testament to NATO lasting for what, decades at this point. I mean, it's really impressive.
Well, it's interesting that everyone that I speak to bring up uh, BRICS as a counterpart to NATO, which it's not, because BRICS is primarily an economic alliance, and you know it never even was necessarily a formal alliance to begin with. It's only starting to be now. The more accurate counterpart to NATO um, um, would be the Shanghai,
CSTO.
yeah, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization,
Yeah.
which does
Yeah.
have these military capabilities which have grown substantially, and that, you know, it's the elephant in the room that I don't hear being discussed that often, because it presents a unique challenge. First of all, they actually do have significant capabilities. Second, they are not necessarily defensive. They may very well have the sort of offensive mandate that NATO does not and never was meant to have. Because back in the day, NATO's enemy was the Warsaw Pact. It wasn't something like this. Certainly, China was not such a big player at the time. You know, it was very much just the Soviet Union and a bunch of much weaker proxies. Now we are facing a whole new set of actors, and some of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization countries are middle powers, significant middle powers, and some are even NATO adjacent allies. So the question is, what do we do about this, and what can we expect from such an alliance when, if we cross out the idea that Russia is operating alone, that it's not, that it's that its ambitions are at crosshairs to all these other countries, not necessarily maybe in the long term, but in the short term, an anti-Western position is all of that share that we see as advantageous in some respect. If it's no longer, you know, a single combatant state that we can expect, and with all its disadvantages, you know, such as the unguarded bases, but part of this growing power with countries that want to have very significant naval capabilities, and with countries that are growing their air forces, albeit not as well as the United States and you know, some of its allies, but still. What sort of a picture do we see? What sort of a potential for future confrontations can we expect if we consider Russia not as a sole power, you know, advancing its images, but part of this alliance?
Yeah. So in a, I look at the world a little differently, right? I think no matter how weak the Canadian military got,
Mhm,
Canada has no fear that the United States is going to invade it, right?
mhm.
I mean, we're neighbors, and we're good neighbors, right? The United States is a very good neighbor to Canada. And I'm proud of that, right? I'm proud to say that I'm American and I can say that. Um, I don't think you can say the same thing about the border between China and Russia, right? No matter how much Russia gets degraded in this fight in Ukraine, I don't think Vladimir Putin ever has in his calculus, China will never attack us, right? Because they don't trust each other, right? And Xi Jinping has aspirations too. If he didn't, he wouldn't be building up as much as he is, right? So I have a different dynamic in calculus. And I think as militaries are being decimated and military capability is being eroded, and I'm not just talking about in Russia, right? I'm talking about in the Middle East. I'm talking about the Houthis, for example, right? Houthis are technically at war with the regime of Yemen that was been thrown out along with the Saudis. So if the Houthis continue this battle space with the U.S. over the straits at the southern tip of the Red Sea, how much do they want to be degraded in their military before Saudi and the former Yemenis government go, okay, we want to come back at you because you've been weakened. It's the same situation with Russia, right? Vladimir Putin can only weaken his military to the point where he still believes that he's got enough of a threat to the neighbors so that they don't come in. Canada and Mexico never have to worry about with the United States.
Well, that raises a question about, again, that eternal question of defensive versus offensive. It is true that NATO has never had any aspirations of attacking Russia. They wanted to safeguard themselves from being attacked by the Soviet Union, and now, Russia and other potential threats, including very specifically China. But, that doesn't mean that they haven't engaged in cyber action and stops short of this full-on mobilization that everyone very clearly thinks of as offensive action. So, what is there in NATO's capabilities and arsenal? What can they do to push back short of engaging in full-on combat before it gets to that point? This sort of distrust between China and Russia, or between, Iran and Russia, we have seen that, but we haven't seen really these capabilities being mobilized to encourage this sort of distrust and increase it. We're seeing a lot of very straightforward defense discussions about budgets. I'm not hearing any lateral discussion about covert infiltrations and things that would just cause problems among our adversaries.
Yeah, what NATO can do and what individual countries can do are very different, right? And I'll give you an example, right? When the Syria war in Aleppo, I'm saying the name of the city wrong, Aleppo, right? It's Aleppo, that's the right name. When that was, a firebed, you had U.S. Air Forces, you had NATO Air Forces, and you had Russian Air Forces all flying over Syria at the same time. And at one point, the Russian aviators violated the airspace of Syria and flew into Turkey. And Erdogan said, if you do that again, I'm going to shoot your airplane down. And lo and behold, Russia flew into Turkey again, and Erdogan shot down a Russian airplane. I mean, I remember because I thought this was going to be escalate to World War III. Right here, you've got a NATO country literally shooting down a Russian fighter jet, and lo and behold, it didn't lead to World War III. So that's good, right? That's a good thing. So you could see that there's NATO countries, or at least NATO leaders out there that have no gumption of taking action against Russian violations of its airspace. It gave a warning the first time, and then it shot the airplane down. And then after that, there were no more violations, right? So that's good. I think it's also interesting, right, that you've got Erdogan's meeting with Vladimir Putin very soon, right? And in Turkey, by the way, while there's an international warrant for the arrest of Vladimir Putin at this point. So does Erdogan turn him in? I don't think he will, but I don't think they recognize the ICC. But it's an interesting dynamic, right? Here's a NATO country that's hosting the number one threat, who has an international warrant out for him, and it's going to be welcome into Ankara and probably go home.
So that kind of, this complex dynamic, shall we say, with Russia having historical interest in Bosphorus and Dardanelles, and Turkey playing both sides and very much giving advantage to Russia financially, at least, if not militarily. We are seeing this, and the whole, controversy over S-400s, which is now being apparently reconsidered after the failures in Ukraine and in favor of F-35s. But given all of this, that NATO has been relatively effective in terms of, well, first of all, continuing to exist and being considered serious enough of an alliance for Russia to make threats against it. But on the other hand, you have all these conflicting internal interests, which makes communications, secure communications on very sensitive subjects, a challenge, to put it mildly. Given that Turkey alone, not to mention Hungary, not to mention various conflicting German interests, assorted small countries with now more pro-Russian looking governments, given all these conflicting things, how does NATO function as an entity that can protect its? I mean, part of the reason why it may not have come to a point of direct confrontation is because some of these political moves are being filtered enough to for Russia to take political steps in to the advantage and not having to run up into the dilemma. Isn't that in itself a problem?
Yeah. So look, I with 2 years at NATO headquarters, I will tell you that how NATO functions is an enigma, right? It's not pretty, it's not sexy, it's not efficient. But one of Winston Churchill's got a million famous quotes, but one of his most famous is the only thing worse than having allies is not having allies, right? And he's right. Like there were many times where you would be, and the guys were down in the trenches, the operators, if you will, right? So Erdogan would say something and it would make international news, and the next day I'd go to work and I'd be sitting next to a Hungarian colonel, and I'm like, hey, you see what your boss said? So he's like, yeah, dude, and we just shake it off, right? But to be fair, they were doing the same thing with Donald Trump when he was in charge of the United States, right? Did you see what your leader said? I'm like, yeah, I saw. Yeah, let's just all keep trying to work it. Let's keep rowing the boat. Keep rowing the boat, right? We just keep moving forward. So yeah.
Would it be fair to say in that context that NATO's biggest challenge right now is not necessarily military, not necessarily the prospect of an immediate confrontation with Russia, but political? The fact that Russia, China, and various other countries with infinite, spending on intelligence capabilities alone, and are much more, in fact, probably much more focused on that than even their military action, that they're throwing all their resources in that direction. Isn't that this long-term evolution and this long-term erosion of internal cohesion much more an immediate threat, and potentially, all these anti-Western countries can sort of expand their influence without having to fire a shot?
Yeah, I'll take it one step further. I wouldn't even say it's a political issue of the foreign countries. It's actually a political issue inside NATO. Right. So it's actually the NATO countries' political leadership that is probably the biggest thing that hamstrings NATO. The former Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, General Breedlove, right? He wrote the foreword to my most recent fiction thriller, Russian Puppeteer, and it's about a fictitious war between Ukraine and Russia, and it goes into a lot of these dynamics that are diplomatic. Doesn't really focus so much on war, focus on the diplomatic and the political. So it's really fascinating. But right after the Ukraine Crimea incident happened, he said, I want to have an exercise, and I don't want any forces. The forces will all be fictitious, but I want to exercise the NAC, the North Atlantic Council, because these are the decision makers. These are the ones who have to approve the orders for the forces to go do things, right? And of course, those take political decisions. The diplomats can vote yes or no, but it's all based on whoever's sitting in the capital of a given country. And there was this false perception that he proved true, that well, yeah, if Russia does anything, NATO forces will immediately be there. Well, you would look, I can't go into all this stuff, but you would be amazed, tragically, sadly amazed, by the way, at how long it took in an exercise for the NAC, right, to completely get on board for him to actually mobilize forces and then bring them forward. And he showed them, and then he went in and briefed and said, okay, guys, look, you expect forces like in 24, 48, or 72 hours, but like, you are the leaders. I can only react to what you ask for.
Mm-hmm.
We have civilian control of the military for a reason, but that means you have to be willing to make tough political decisions. And, sitting around a big circular table and everyone pointing to pointing to the guy next to him is just a big circle of everyone pointing at each other. And that's not making decisions. So the good thing is the NAC got exercised. A lot of those things were streamlined. There are now, safeguards and things in place that actually expedite some of these things. So that's good. But the political leadership in a lot of these countries is sometimes very unwilling to take action. And if one is unwilling, they're all unwilling because everyone has a veto at the NAC, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, that brings me to a kind of so to circle back to the issue of Ukraine and some of the debates we're having inside the United States and presumably elsewhere as well, which is kind of, a self-fulfilling prophecy argument in some sense. A lot of the people who are opposed to additional funding for Ukraine or who want to make it conditional on X, Y, and Z, and I'm not talking about the border security issue, I'm just talking about, that is obviously a very domestic political game being played. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about specifically Ukraine as Ukraine. They're basically saying, well, Ukraine is obviously not winning, so why should we, invest any more of taxpayers' money, spend, put ourselves at risk, deteriorate our relations with Russia, and, essentially get stranded in this long-term political complication, if not a military issue. But of course, ironically, the less you give, the more the adversary is going to advance, and the more advantage they're going to have. So this is kind of circular reasoning right there. So in light of what you just said, this unwillingness of these political actors to do what's necessary to put an end to obvious threats. How do, those threats are only going to persist, and there's no military solution to them, because at the end of the day, the military is what you invest in it. That's all it is. It is ultimately responsive to the political decision making and political will. So how do we traverse this dilemma?
Yeah, so I don't know if you're a big football fan, right? If you're an NFL football fan and you watch NFL, but this last weekend there was a game between the San Francisco 49ers and the Lions, and the Lions were doing great in the first half. As a matter of fact, they're doing so good, that this would be the same argument. Like, why would San Francisco go back out in the second half and try and win the game? They were being destroyed, so there was no reason for them to take the field, right? And lo and behold, they came back from behind and they won. So that this notion that we shouldn't be funding Ukraine because they're losing is somewhat stupid, right? That's a really bad argument. I mean, that just because you're losing doesn't mean you lost. It means you're losing at this point, but you're still fighting, just like the San Francisco 49ers did. Again, I'm a big fan of history, and I think that what the United States lacks right now is strong, effective political leadership on both sides of the aisle. This isn't just against Joe Biden. I think the Speaker of the House is so focused on the border that he can't get off that, right. And he can't really look at bigger issues. There are some Republicans out there like Don Bacon, who actually I went to flight school with. He's a congressman from Nebraska. He's a former brigadier general too, so he understands the threat that Vladimir Putin is to the world. So we'll talk about this. Congressman Gonzalez from Florida, down in the Keys in Miami. He's also a big advocate for military force. But when you look at World War II, right? The United States was attacked on December 7th, 1941. And at the time, Roosevelt, because he was a strong political leader, was able to effectively communicate to the US people that we were going to war, but we were not going to go back and strike Tokyo. That the first thing we were going to do is go into Europe, right? Now imagine trying to do that today, right? Imagine Joe Biden trying to communicate effectively to the people that when the United States was attacked, that we're not going to go back and attack that, but we're going to attack somewhere on the other side of the world. I don't think that he has that political capacity. And this isn't an attack on Joe Biden. I just from everything I've seen from him, I don't think he would have that Roosevelt-esque ability to do that. And yes, a couple, 4, 5, 6 months later, we were actually to go back in with the Doolittle Raiders and bomb Tokyo. But he effectively sent U.S. forces into Europe first, right? And that was massive, right? So We need effective leadership. We need people who can communicate why it's important to support Ukraine, which is why I try and go on these shows and talk about these things, right? I think Russia is a clear and present danger to the United States. It's a clear and present danger to our national security interests, and along with the alliances that we've established. And while there's many people in the United States who don't, they're like, well, these alliances, these people haven't paid their 2%, they haven't done this, they haven't. Well, okay, well, yeah, 2% is actually not the rule, right? That's an aspiration. They got away with it for years. They yes, for shame on that, but we didn't break the alliance then, right? And by the way, after September 11th, many of these nations went in and fought and died in Afghanistan and Iraq with U.S. forces, right? The European nations went in after an Article 5 tick and supported us, right? So this notion that we wouldn't be there for them is a fallacy.
Finally, there's a question that's, I think, a little bit of an uncomfortable question, not that, which I'm very good at, asking awkward questions that no one wants to hear. The element of surprise. The one thing Russia has been exceptionally good at is take advantage of the blind spots and create these fictitious theatrical productions that nevertheless caught our agencies by surprise. And I'm afraid Russia is not the only one. We have been caught by surprise repeatedly with the assessment of Afghanistan capabilities, with the assessment of the whole Gaza situation and Hamas, which yes, you can say Israel hasn't been doing the job, but neither have we. And of course, the incident with Prigozhin alone was an illustration of how another nation can hoodwink us into just not being able to react quickly to a seemingly unexpected development. Where do we stand? And there's been articles written about the agencies and the military and this and that and why that is the case. But after all these articles, what have we done about it since all of that stuff became obvious? Has there been any restructuring to be able to think more laterally and to be prepared for the unexpected? And why have we fallen so far behind when we have the sort of freedom that many of these nations do not, and we have the sort of creative outlet even within our highly bureaucratic structures compared to China or Russia? We are at an advantage. Why are we so lagging behind on this front?
Yeah, so I'm glad this is your last question, right? Because I think it's really a good one, right? I'm really active on Twitter or on X, right? And I'm at Jeff Fish, JEFFFISCH. I have tens of thousands of followers, and I actively engage with Russian trolls, right? I actively engage with them on everything. And what I found in the information space is you can debate until you're blue in the face with them, right? And you'll lose. But I've also found that if you have far more conviction for your case than theirs, they'll back down. And it's starting to prove true. And I'll give you an example. Last week, an IL-76 was shot down by Ukraine, and Russia immediately came out and said that there were 65 Ukrainian POWs on the airplane, and Ukraine had shot down and killed their own people. Well, pretty much immediately the facts didn't start adding up, right? So I openly put out on Twitter, look, I'll bet any of you Russian trolls $50. And I started naming them, right? I called them out by name. A $50 bet, we'll have so-and-so hold the money. I have conviction that there were not 65 on the airplane. If within the next 6 months, DNA remains are handed over from Russia to Ukraine of these 65 guys on a manifest, I'll give you $50. But in 6 months, if Russia can't produce any of this DNA, right, cannot produce any of this information, then you owe me. And none of them would take the bet, right? So I found this fascinating, right? It's a matter of conviction. And I would argue that this is scalable, right? It's not just about Jeff Fischer, Colonel Jeff Fischer, and some Russian trolls. That if nations can take, with conviction in their position as well, that these trolls and these, not only trolls, but the narrative out of Moscow can be challenged and squashed. These zinger, as you said, surprise information campaigns that come out of the blue, as long as you can do your homework and disprove it immediately, and not only disprove it, but then come and say, hey, if this is true, then logically these next steps would have to happen. an airplane crash, there's DNA, there's bodies, there's things that are turned over. Let's see if that happens, right? Here we are a week and a half later, and Russia doesn't want to talk about the POWs anymore. What? Why not? Right? Because they realize they've already moved on to the next narrative. They know that it was complete bullshit, and yet now you can keep using that against the trolls every time they come out with a new thing. I'm like, dude, I'm still waiting for my $50. I'm still waiting for my $50 from the last one. So where's your conviction? If you really believe in the Russian narrative as much as you say you do, put your money where your mouth is. And it doesn't have to be money, right? There's other ways to have conviction towards your position. It was the easiest one on Twitter to bring forward. So
that's great, and I hope we take it into consideration, because yes, complacency can be changed. We can wake up, but at the end of the day, if you don't actually believe in what we're doing, if you're not ready to stand up for what we claim to be standing up with, that's how we end up getting fooled again and again, whether by terrorist organization or state actors.
Yep.
Thank you so much for joining us today. For everyone watching, Jeffrey Fischer was on the Washington Outsider Report to discuss whether we can expect another war in Europe, a bigger one from Russia, or should we be looking at a different scenario instead. And please join us next week again, same time, Tuesday night at 9 p.m. for our next program. Thank you very much and have a great night.